I remember the exact tone of his voice when he said it. Soft, almost tender, like he was delivering a mercy instead of a wound. "You saved my life, Ellen," he whispered, his hands folded neatly in his lap, eyes fixed somewhere beyond me. "But I can't keep living a lie." That's what he called it. A lie. 33 years of marriage, 2 children grown, 1 death between us, and hundreds of quiet mornings spent spooning oatmeal and measuring out medication while he was dying. And now, suddenly, it was all a lie. I had nursed him through 3 years of cancer, fed him when he couldn't lift a spoon, bathed him when he was too weak to stand, slept in a chair beside his hospital bed so that when he woke and couldn't breathe, I'd be there. I learned to read his pain through the tremor in his jaw. I learned to sleep with one ear open for the sound of him crying into the pillow, because he thought I couldn't hear. I gave him every part of my body, every ounce of patience, every waking moment of my strength. And when he finally recovered, when the oncologist smiled and used the word remission, when everyone toasted to his second chance, he decided his second chance didn't include me. I'm 68 now. I live alone in a rented bungalow near the coast, small enough that I can hear the sea when the wind is right. I plant herbs in chipped ceramic pots on the windowsill. I make coffee for 1, not 2, and sometimes I still reach for an extra cup before remembering. But this isn't where the story begins. This is where it lands after the storm is past and the house has been rebuilt with fewer rooms. Back then, I still believed in the kind of loyalty that endures illness and exhaustion. I thought survival would make us sacred to each other. I thought if I could bring him back from death, he would never leave me again. When David was first diagnosed, I remember how fragile he looked in the hospital gown, how his skin, once golden from golf and sunlight, turned waxy under fluorescent light. He cried once, just once, the night they told us it had spread to his lymph nodes. He said he didn't want to die, and I promised he wouldn't. I said it like a priest giving absolution, like if I believed it hard enough, the body would obey. I became nurse, wife, caretaker, advocate, shadow. My world shrank to the size of his chart. I learned to speak in milligrams and side effects. Friends stopped visiting because illness made them uncomfortable. The children came when they could, but it was mostly me. Me and the beeping of machines, me and the lists of medications taped to the fridge, me and the steady, slow erosion of our intimacy into something clinical. He told me once, halfway through his second round of chemo, that he didn't deserve me. I thought it was humility, a man overwhelmed by gratitude. But now I think it was rehearsal. He was preparing the words that would one day sound noble in his own ears. I don't deserve you. As if betrayal could be disguised as self-awareness. As if leaving someone after she'd cleaned your vomit was an act of moral clarity. I can still picture the night it happened, the night the lie was named. The living room smelled of antiseptic because I'd been wiping down the recliner where he used to rest after therapy. He was standing near the window, freshly shaven, wearing the blue shirt I had bought him before his first operation. He looked healthy again, almost handsome. I remember thinking how strange it was to see color in his cheeks, how the lines around his eyes had softened, how alive he looked. Then he turned to me and said those words. I thought at first he meant he was leaving for a walk, or that he'd had another bad dream. But no, he was leaving the life I had rebuilt around him. He'd found someone who, in his words, reminded him of possibility. She was his physical therapist, 30 years younger. She had taught him to walk again, and apparently to fall in love again. The cruelest part was how gentle he tried to be. He spoke about gratitude, about respect, about not wanting to hurt me. He called me his guardian angel, as though I were some kind of celestial nursemaid sent only for the dying season of his life. When he said he hoped I'd find peace, I nearly laughed. Peace was what I used to pray for every night while changing his dressings. Peace was what I thought we'd both earned when the test results came back clean. Instead, I got the kind of silence that hums inside your chest like a trapped insect. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I asked him if she knew he still wet the bed sometimes, if she'd ever held a man's head while he vomited up morphine. He winced, but didn't answer. I wanted him to feel the weight of what he was discarding, not me, but the labor, the years, the caretaking that had turned me into a ghost of myself. I asked him when it began. He said he didn't know. During rehab, maybe, he murmured, as though infidelity were an involuntary symptom. I realized then that illness doesn't purify people. It only strips away their disguises. He wasn't transformed by pain. He was just waiting to escape it with a new story, one where he was reborn and I was the relic of the sick room. After he left, the house echoed differently. Every object betrayed me. The kettle we'd bought after his first surgery, the slippers beside his chair, the framed photo of us in Italy that I couldn't bring myself to take down. The smell of antiseptic lingered for weeks, even after I scrubbed the floors. I caught myself listening for his cough, the one that used to rattle through the hallway at night. When it didn't come, I felt both relief and loss, like a widow who knows her mourning is indecent because the man she grieves is still alive. People like to imagine betrayal arrives with drama, slammed doors, shouted accusations, but it doesn't. It creeps in quietly, disguised as recovery. One day you're helping him dress, and the next he's taking selfies at the gym with a woman who calls him my brave fighter. When I saw the photos online, he looked unrecognizable, not because of the muscles, but because of the grin. The same mouth that used to whisper, "Don't let me die," was now saying, "New beginnings." Friends didn't know what to say. They called it unfortunate, complicated, human. My daughter suggested therapy. My son suggested forgiveness. Everyone had advice, but no one had lived the years I had. The sleepless nights, the constant fear that any cough meant the cancer was back. The way I'd held my breath every time the phone rang from the hospital. How do you forgive someone who only survived because you refused to give up? I found myself talking to the walls sometimes, narrating the day as though he were still in the next room. "Breakfast is ready," I'd say to no one. "It's oatmeal, just how you like it." Then I'd laugh at the absurdity of it and let the bowl grow cold. The hardest part wasn't his absence. It was the sudden end of purpose. When you've built your life around tending someone else's pain, you forget what to do with your own hands once they're empty. So yes, when people ask where I live now, I tell them near the coast. I say I'm retired, that I like the sea air, that I volunteer at the animal shelter sometimes. But what I don't say is that I came here because I needed to live somewhere that didn't remind me of hospital corridors or wedding photos. I came here because every street in our old town smelled like antiseptic and memory. The sea, at least, doesn't care who you used to be. It accepts what you throw into it, letters, rings, whole decades, and returns nothing but salt. Even now, some mornings I wake before dawn and half expect to hear him breathing beside me. The mind clings to its habits. I lie still, listening to the rhythm of the waves outside, and think about the strange symmetry of it all. I once kept him alive with my vigilance. Now I keep myself alive by letting go. People tell me I should be proud of what I did, that caregiving is an act of love. But love should not feel like erasure. It shouldn't end with someone telling you your devotion was a phase he outgrew. That's where I am now, somewhere between grief and clarity, learning to inhabit the silence he left behind without apologizing for the sound of my own breath. I used to believe I'd saved his life. Lately, I think maybe I just postponed the day he'd leave me. And yet, even that feels like a kind of grace. Because in saving him, I learned how strong a woman can be when no one is watching. Because in being left, I discovered there are worse things than loneliness. There is the life unlived while waiting to be needed. So that's where the story starts. Not in the hospital, not in the house he abandoned, but in the moment he said, "You saved my life, Ellen, but I can't keep living a lie." I used to think the lie was our marriage. Now I know the lie was that I needed him to survive. It began, I suppose, on an ordinary Tuesday, the kind of day that disappears into the others if you don't watch it closely. The house was finally quiet again after months of nurses and alarms and my constant footsteps from kitchen to bedroom and back. The walls no longer echoed with the faint hum of machines. The windows were open, letting in spring air that smelled faintly of lilac and bleach. David had been declared in remission a few weeks before, a phrase that felt more like a parole than a victory. I wanted to believe it meant safety, a return to life, but he treated it as though the world owed him something more extravagant than survival. He started waking early again, showering twice a day, humming to himself while shaving. He said he felt restless, which I mistook for hope. I thought he was finding his way back to himself and maybe to me. I couldn't have known that what he was really doing was rehearsing his exit. I still remember the first time I saw her name written in his planner. PT, Camille, 3 p.m. It looked harmless enough, another appointment in the long sequence of therapies that filled his schedule. I even encouraged it, told him it was good that he was finally strong enough to attend sessions without me. He came home flushed with exertion, talking about how she pushed him, how she believed in his potential. I listened, smiling, because I wanted to hear him sound alive again. The way he said her name didn't bother me at first. It was just part of his new vocabulary, the language of recovery. But slowly, I began to notice how often she appeared in his sentences, how her name softened his voice. He began to say "we" instead of "she," as in, "we worked on balance today," or "we might try swimming next week." I didn't realize that the balance he was practicing wasn't just for his legs. It was the delicate equilibrium between guilt and desire, between the woman who had kept him alive and the one who made him feel reborn. He started to pull away in small, almost invisible ways. He insisted on doing his own laundry, which he'd never done before, and I told myself it was good, a sign of independence. He said he needed more space in the bedroom for his recovery equipment. So I cleared out drawers, moved my books, even took down the family photos from the dresser because he said they distracted him. When he started spending longer hours out of the house, I convinced myself he was meeting old friends or walking to build endurance. I didn't yet understand that distance was his new therapy. One afternoon, he came home later than usual. His hair was damp, his shirt smelled faintly of a floral detergent I didn't use, and there was a brightness in his eyes I hadn't seen in years. He said he'd stopped by the juice bar near the clinic. I asked if he wanted dinner, and he said he'd already eaten something light. Then he hugged me, a quick, perfunctory hug, and went upstairs. When I followed an hour later, he was sitting on the edge of the bed, scrolling through his phone, smiling faintly. I stood there, watching him, trying to find the man I'd known beneath the glow of that little screen. He looked up, startled, and said, "What's wrong?" I said nothing, only turned off the lamp and lay down beside him. I remember the space between our bodies felt wider than the ocean. A few days later, the phone rang while he was in the shower. I answered without thinking. The voice on the other end was young, cheerful, slightly breathless. "Hi, it's Camille. I'm just confirming David's session tomorrow." "Oh, I'm sorry, is this Mrs. Harrow?" I said yes, and she paused for a second, just long enough for me to imagine she was measuring her tone. "Right," she said brightly. "Please remind him to bring comfortable clothes. We're doing partner work." I thanked her and hung up, my hand suddenly cold. Partner work. The word slid through me like something sharp and invisible. That night, I asked him casually about the session. He said it was just balance training, nothing serious. I nodded, pretending not to notice the faint pink line on his neck where a woman's lipstick had brushed his collar. The next day, while he was out, I opened his laptop. It wasn't my habit, but curiosity in grief is not the same as curiosity in ordinary life. It's an act of survival. His email was open. There were messages from her, short but intimate in their carelessness. "You're doing great, David. Remember to hydrate. You make even the hard days feel easy." Nothing explicit, but the tone was wrong, the punctuation too warm. And then there was one I couldn't unsee. "I can't stop thinking about the way you smiled today." That was when I understood. I didn't confront him immediately. I wish I could say I threw the laptop at the wall or screamed until he confessed. But after 3 years of tending to his every breath, my first reaction was not rage. It was exhaustion, a kind of bone-deep fatigue that made even standing feel like a burden. I closed the laptop gently and went to the kitchen. I made tea. I sat at the table and stared at the steam rising from the cup, trying to reconcile the man who had clung to my hand through chemotherapy with the one who was now slipping away for someone else's touch. When he came home, I asked him if he'd enjoyed his session. He smiled, said yes, that he felt stronger every day. Then he thanked me for making dinner, for everything I'd done, and the sincerity in his voice was almost unbearable. Gratitude, I realized, can be the cruelest language of all when it's the prelude to abandonment. He was already practicing how to say goodbye without saying it. The next morning, I drove him to his appointment. Camille met us in the lobby. She was younger than I'd imagined, her face open and untroubled, her hair pulled into a careless knot that looked effortless. She had the confidence of someone who'd never had to beg life for mercy. When she greeted me, her eyes flicked over me politely, dismissively, like I was a patient's mother rather than his wife. "We'll take good care of him," she said. "We." I almost laughed at the plural, at how easily it erased me. I waited in the car for an hour, then 2, watching the clinic doors and pretending not to imagine what might be happening inside. That evening, he told me he didn't need me to drive him anymore. He said it kindly, with that new, gentle tone that always meant a decision had already been made. He wanted to be independent. He wanted to explore new routines. I nodded, smiling, because I didn't know what else to do. When he left the next morning, he kissed the top of my head as though I were a child or a dying pet. That's when I knew something irreversible had begun. A week later, I found the receipt from a hotel, a local one, the kind used by people who need a few hours of privacy. It was folded neatly into his wallet, dated for a Tuesday, the day of his double therapy session. My name was still on the medical bills, still on the mortgage, still on every prescription bottle in the house. But none of it mattered. The contract that counted, the silent one between two people who promised to hold each other through everything, had already been broken. When I confronted him that night, I didn't shout. I placed the receipt on the table and waited. He looked at it, then at me, and said quietly, "It's not what you think." But it was exactly what I thought, and we both knew it. I asked how long. He said it didn't matter. I asked if he loved her. He didn't answer, which was answer enough. Then he said something I'll never forget. "You gave me back my life, Ellen, but I can't spend the rest of it paying for that gift." That was the moment everything inside me went still. There was no dramatic noise, no weeping, just a terrible clarity that filled the room like gas. He walked upstairs, and I stayed at the table long after the sound of his footsteps disappeared. The teapot whistled on the stove, but I didn't move to turn it off. I sat there listening to the sound grow shrill, then fade into silence when the flame burned out. The next morning, his suitcase was packed. He said he was going to stay with a friend for a while to figure things out. I didn't ask which friend. When the door closed behind him, the house seemed to exhale. The clock ticked, the refrigerator hummed, the ordinary noises of life resumed, but everything had changed. I walked into the bedroom and looked at the empty half of the closet, the dent his shoes had left in the carpet. It struck me that I had spent 3 years fighting for his life and not one moment preparing for my own after he was gone. That was the true beginning, the quiet catastrophe that splits a life in two. Not the illness, not the recovery, but that single realization. I had saved a man who no longer wanted the life I'd saved for him. And in that moment, standing in the wreckage of our ordinary morning, I understood that love doesn't always die with sickness. Sometimes it dies with health. After he left, the house didn't feel empty right away. It felt occupied by the ghost of his routines, as though absence could still make noise. His toothbrush stayed in the holder for weeks, his razor on the shelf beside mine, and every time I entered the bathroom, I caught the faintest scent of his aftershave mixed with antiseptic. I didn't throw anything out at first. I told myself I was just giving him time to think, that maybe he'd realize he'd made a mistake and call. There's a strange cruelty in hope. It disguises itself as patience, but it's really just a slow form of self-harm. I left the porch light on at night for a man who had already stopped looking back. Days became elongated and soft, like they'd been stretched too far. I moved through them in silence, washing dishes, folding laundry, checking the mailbox as though a letter might arrive, explaining everything. At night, the house sounded different. Even the air seemed heavier. I tried to read, but the words refused to settle. I cooked meals I couldn't eat because the motions of caring were the only ones I still knew. I left his favorite mug on the counter every morning out of habit. The handle wore a thin mark of my thumb, a tiny hollow in porcelain from years of washing, proof that some objects remember more than people do. He called once, a week after he left. His voice was brisk, almost professional. He said he was fine, that he needed space, that I shouldn't worry. I asked where he was staying, and he said it didn't matter. I could hear traffic behind him, laughter, the murmur of some woman's voice. I recognized the rhythm, the kind of light, teasing voice that belongs to someone who hasn't yet learned what love costs. I asked if he was eating well, if he needed anything, and he said, "Please don't mother me." That was when I realized he didn't just want to be free of me. He wanted to erase the version of himself that needed me. The following weeks passed like water dripping through a cracked pipe, slow, relentless, impossible to ignore. The phone stayed quiet. I learned to stop checking it. Friends tried to visit, but I couldn't bear their pitying looks, the careful pauses between their sentences. They wanted to tell me I'd done enough, that I was better off, that at least he was alive. None of them understood that being better off feels like standing in a field after a storm. You're grateful to be alive, but you're still surrounded by wreckage. I told them I needed rest, which was only half a lie. What I needed was to hear nothing, to rebuild the silence in my own image instead of his. Eventually, I forced myself to clear his things. I started with the closet. I folded his shirts, one by one, smoothing each sleeve before laying it in a box. The muscle memory of care was still in me. I couldn't just shove them in as though they meant nothing. Every fabric carried its own season. Linen for summers in Maine. Flannel for winters when he'd complain about the draft in the bedroom. I found an old hospital bracelet tangled in the cuff of a sweater. The plastic was cracked. The ink faded. His name, my birthday, and the date of his last surgery were still faintly visible. I held it for a long time, tracing the curve of each number, remembering how fragile he'd looked that morning, how I'd kissed his forehead before they wheeled him in. The same man who'd once whispered, "Don't let go of my hand," had now taken someone else's. The hardest part wasn't the packing. It was what came after. The empty spaces. The blank hangers. The absence of sound when I opened a drawer expecting resistance. I left his wedding ring on the nightstand for a while, half hoping he'd come back for it. When he didn't, I slid it into a small wooden box that used to hold my sewing needles. I couldn't throw it away. I wasn't ready to treat something that had once symbolized forever like common trash. I placed the box in the bottom drawer, beside his old watch that no longer worked, and closed it quietly. It felt like sealing a wound. The world outside went on as if nothing had happened. Neighbors waved, unaware of the implosion behind my door. Bills arrived, grocery stores played the same music, and the seasons shifted as though grief had no authority over time. I started walking in the evenings, partly to exhaust myself, partly to feel the air move against my skin. The first few times, I caught myself counting steps, a habit I'd picked up from tracking his physiotherapy routines. Somewhere between the 5th and 6th block, I realized I was breathing in rhythm with my own pace again. It was a small thing, but it felt like permission. One morning, while sorting through paperwork, I found an envelope addressed to both of us from the Cancer Foundation. Inside was a thank you letter for a donation he'd made in our names. It was dated 2 weeks before he left. I stared at the printed signature, wondering if it had been his farewell disguised as generosity, a gesture to ease his guilt before vanishing. I folded it back into the envelope and placed it on the mantel, next to a photo from the first year of his illness. In it, I was leaning over him, laughing, my hand on his shoulder. His eyes were closed, mouth slightly open in exhaustion. At the time, I thought it captured devotion. Now I saw it for what it was, documentation of imbalance, one person giving everything while the other receded behind the curtain of their own pain. The small cruelties began to surface in unexpected ways. I discovered he'd rerouted our shared savings account into his personal one a month before leaving. When I called the bank, the woman on the line spoke in the kind of voice reserved for the bereaved. She said there was nothing she could do without his consent. Consent, a word that had governed my every action during his treatment. Does this hurt? Do you need water? Do you want me to stay? I'd spent years seeking his consent for kindness, and now he withheld it for fairness. I hung up and sat for a long time, staring at the checkbook, feeling the slow bloom of humiliation that comes when you realize even your generosity has been taken for granted. Nights were the worst. I'd wake at 3 a.m, heart racing, convinced I heard the oxygen monitor beeping from the hospital years. The body remembers what the mind tries to forget. I'd sit on the edge of the bed, the silence pressing against my ears until it became a sound of its own. Sometimes I'd talk to him, not out of madness, but habit. "Are you comfortable?" I'd whisper into the dark. "Do you need another blanket?" Old reflexes die hard, especially the ones born of love that was never returned in equal measure. A month passed before I ventured into the attic. It smelled of dust and forgotten summers. I opened boxes we'd packed decades ago, finding relics of a life that now felt borrowed. Postcards from Italy, birthday cards signed in both our names, his handwriting neat and optimistic. I found the letters he'd written to me during our early years, when we still believed in each other. Reading them was like holding fossils, proof that tenderness had once existed, but only as something extinct. I burned one in the fireplace, just to see what it would feel like. The paper curled slowly, words turning to ash, and I watched until nothing remained but gray powder. It wasn't anger I felt, nor relief, just an odd sense of balance. For every piece of him that had gone missing from my present, another was being erased from my past. By the second month, people stopped asking how I was. Grief has an expiration date for everyone except the grieving. I went through motions, bills, laundry, meals, but each task felt like moving furniture in a house that no longer belonged to me. One afternoon, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. Her hair had gone completely silver without her noticing. There was a calmness in her face that looked almost defiant. That was the first day I didn't cry. Still, the small humiliations continued. A mutual friend called to tell me she'd run into him at a restaurant. "He looks wonderful," she said, before realizing her mistake. I thanked her anyway. After I hung up, I stood by the window and imagined him sitting across from Camille, laughing, his hand resting easily on hers, the same hand that had once clutched mine in fear. The image didn't hurt the way I expected. It was almost clinical, like watching a patient who no longer needs you. The cruelty of being left after caretaking isn't just loneliness, it's redundancy. You spend years defining yourself by someone else's fragility, and when they recover, they walk away with their strength while you're left holding the memory of their weakness. I realized that what I missed most wasn't even him. It was the purpose he had given me. Without him, my days felt shapeless, like air trying to hold form. Around that time, I stopped wearing my wedding ring. I didn't take it off ceremoniously. One evening, while washing dishes, it slipped from my finger into the sink. I caught it before it fell down the drain, but instead of putting it back on, I placed it in the dish rack to dry. The next morning, it was still there, glinting in the light like a question I no longer needed to answer. I put it in a drawer and closed it. The house grew quieter, but the quiet changed quality. It no longer sounded like morning. It sounded like room being made for something else, though I didn't yet know what. I began to take longer walks, sometimes driving to the edge of town where the ocean wind smelled of iron and salt. I watched waves roll against the shore and thought of how they never resist retreat. They go out and come back endlessly, each withdrawal a preparation for return. Maybe, I thought, that's what I was doing. Receding, gathering, waiting for the moment I could come back to myself. By the end of that 3rd month, I realized I had survived something after all. Not his illness this time, but my own blindness. The woman who had once slept in a hospital chair to keep him breathing was now breathing for herself, quietly, steadily, without permission. The house was still the same, but it no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like an echo chamber, slowly learning a new sound. Mine. It was around the beginning of autumn when something inside me shifted. Not in an instant, not dramatically, but with the slow certainty of a tide deciding to turn. The heat had thinned. The air tasted faintly of smoke from distant fires, and the afternoons seemed to stretch out like old fabric, fraying at the edges. I had spent the whole summer existing in a kind of suspended state, moving from one day to the next, as if crossing a river by stepping stones, careful not to fall into the memory of him. Then, one morning, as I was watering the plants that I had nearly let die, I realized that the silence around me no longer felt hostile. It was just silence. Ordinary, harmless, almost companionable. I stood there, the hose in my hand, and for the first time since he left, I took a deep breath that didn't ache. That was when I understood that healing doesn't announce itself with trumpets. It arrives quietly, like dawn, and you only notice it when the light has already changed. That same week, I opened a drawer to find a stack of unpaid bills, old letters, and photographs. The mess looked like a snapshot of my mind. I decided to sort it all, not as a symbolic gesture, but because disorder had become too heavy to live with. Among the papers was a pamphlet for a community center, something I'd picked up months ago and forgotten. There was a small note about a local writing group that met on Thursdays. Open to all ages, no experience necessary. I had written stories once in college, before life became an endless series of duties. The thought of sitting in a room full of strangers terrified me, but it also felt like proof that I was still capable of curiosity. So I went. The community center smelled faintly of old coffee and mop water, that comforting scent of places kept alive by volunteers. The group was small. 6 people seated around a table scattered with pens and paper. A man with kind eyes offered me tea and asked my name. When I said it aloud, I felt as though I were reintroducing myself to the world. During introductions, they spoke about poems, short stories, memoirs. When it was my turn, I said I hadn't written in decades, that I wasn't sure I remembered how. The facilitator smiled and said, "Start anywhere. Memory always knows the way back." I wrote about the sea, about how the water never questions what it takes and what it returns. When I read it aloud, my voice trembled, but no one laughed. One woman, whose hands shook with arthritis, said softly, "That's grief, learning how to breathe." I left that night feeling both raw and renewed. The next morning, I decided to take a real walk beyond the neighborhood. The streets were lined with trees shedding yellow leaves, and the air carried that bittersweet scent of endings that always reminded me of school days. I stopped at a small bakery I'd never noticed before, bought a coffee, and sat by the window. I watched people rush past. Couples, teenagers, a woman pushing a stroller. And for once, I didn't feel invisible. There was something liberating in being no one to anyone. When the waitress came to clear my table, she looked at me and said, "You've got one of those peaceful faces. I like it." I thanked her, and though I knew she probably said that to everyone, it stayed with me all day. After so long being seen only through the lens of someone else's needs, even a stranger's simple kindness felt like proof that I still existed. That evening, I went through the wardrobe and began packing the last of his things, the few relics I'd been too sentimental to touch. I folded his coats, sealed the boxes, and called a local donation center. The next day, a young man arrived to collect them. He couldn't have been more than 25. He carried the boxes to his van, then hesitated at the door. "Are you sure you want to give these away?" he asked gently. I looked at the neatly labeled cartons stacked by the doorway and said, "Yes, I'm done being a museum." He smiled, and as he drove off, I watched the van disappear around the corner. It didn't feel like loss. It felt like an exhale that had taken 3 years to release. A few days later, I cleaned the kitchen from top to bottom. There was something meditative about it, the rhythm of wiping, scrubbing, arranging. When I finished, I stood by the window, watching the light fall across the countertop, and thought, this is mine. Not the house, not the furniture, but the moment. The simple, sacred act of claiming space. That evening, I made myself a real dinner for the first time in months. Not leftovers, not something thrown together, but an actual meal. Roasted chicken with lemon and rosemary, a recipe I used to make for him. But this time I cooked it only for myself. I set the table with one plate, one glass, and when I sat down, the loneliness I expected never arrived. Instead, there was calm, quiet, and the realization that solitude is not the absence of love, but the presence of self. That night, before going to bed, I took out my wedding dress. It had been stored in the back of the closet, wrapped in plastic like a fossil. The fabric was yellowed with time, the lace fragile under my fingers. I laid it out on the bed and looked at it for a long time. It no longer evoked nostalgia. It felt like something belonging to another woman, someone who once believed in promises that sickness and betrayal had both erased. I didn't destroy it. I folded it carefully, placed it in a trunk, and labeled it simply, history. That word felt right. Not bitter, not sentimental, just accurate. In the following weeks, small signs of renewal appeared everywhere. I began to sleep through the night without waking to phantom sounds. The garden, which I had neglected all summer, began to bloom again with a stubbornness that felt personal. The lavender thrived despite my inattention. The basil grew wild and fragrant. I started keeping a notebook by my bed, jotting down thoughts that arrived uninvited, lines about silence, about the body remembering joy. Once I wrote, "Maybe survival isn't the end of the story. Maybe it's the beginning of understanding what we endured for." I saw him once during that time, purely by accident. I was at the grocery store reaching for a carton of milk when I heard his voice behind me. I froze. He was laughing, that light, boyish sound I hadn't heard since before the illness. I turned and saw him in the next aisle, holding a basket, Camille beside him. She looked exactly as I'd imagined, youthful, composed, oblivious to everything that had been sacrificed to make her happiness possible. For a moment, our eyes met. He looked startled, then smiled. That careful, diplomatic smile people use when they want to pretend there is no history between them. I nodded once and turned away. My heart didn't race. My hands didn't shake. I simply walked to the checkout, paid for my groceries, and left. Outside, the sky was the color of pewter, heavy with unshed rain. I stood there for a moment, feeling nothing but a strange, quiet gratitude that the encounter was over and that I had survived it without collapsing. That was the first real proof that I was changing. Later that evening, I wrote in my notebook, "The past can follow you like a shadow, but it can't step through light." The next morning, I woke before sunrise, brewed coffee, and watched the sky pale from gray to gold. The horizon looked like forgiveness, not because it erased what came before, but because it allowed the day to begin anyway. I realized that I had spent so long trying to understand why he left, as if logic could undo pain. But some betrayals are not puzzles to be solved. They are thresholds. You cross them, and on the other side, you become someone new. I didn't notice it at the time, but I had already started moving toward a life that was entirely mine. It began with the smallest choices, buying a red scarf instead of the muted ones he always preferred, repainting the bedroom walls a warm cream, learning how to fix the leaky faucet without calling anyone. Each act was a thread, and slowly they wove something stronger than the marriage had ever been, a sense of self that existed without permission. I was still lonely, yes, but it was a clean kind of loneliness, not the corrosive kind that comes from being unseen. By the end of that autumn, the house no longer smelled of loss. It smelled of lavender, of bread baking, of things being made new. I found myself humming sometimes without realizing it. One afternoon, while folding laundry, I caught my reflection in the mirror again. I looked older, of course, but there was a steadiness in my eyes that hadn't been there before, a quiet knowledge that I could survive not just illness or abandonment, but the absence of everything I once thought defined me. I understood then that healing is not the same as forgetting. It's remembering without bleeding. That realization became my new truth. I no longer waited for apologies, for closure, for explanations that would never satisfy me. I began to believe that maybe the only real closure comes from choosing to live well despite what has been broken. And on one cool, amber-colored evening, as I stood on the porch watching the first leaves fall, I whispered to no one in particular, "I'm still here." The words didn't echo. They settled, calm and certain, into the air. It wasn't defiance. It was declaration. The midpoint of my story had arrived, not with rescue or reunion, but with quiet endurance, the understanding that sometimes survival is its own kind of love story. It was the winter after that strange, calm autumn when the world decided to test whatever peace I had managed to build. The season arrived harsh and early, with winds that tore through the trees and a kind of cold that made every joint ache. I had begun to think of myself as safe by then, not healed perhaps, but settled, anchored. The nights no longer frightened me, and the silence of the house had taken on the dignity of solitude rather than the emptiness of abandonment. But peace, I learned, is not the absence of pain. It is the brief pause before it finds a new shape. It started with something as simple as a letter. It arrived on a gray morning, the envelope thin, his handwriting unmistakable. I hadn't seen it in months, but my body remembered it instantly. The slight backward tilt of the L in my name, the confident slope of the H in his. For a moment, I considered not opening it. I thought about throwing it into the fireplace. about denying him even the privilege of being read. But curiosity, no, something more primal than that, forced me to slide a finger beneath the seal. The letter was short, too polite, written with the formality of a man who no longer knows how to speak to you directly. He said he hoped I was well, that he had been thinking about me, that he was sorry for the pain things might have caused. He asked if I would consider meeting for coffee. He said there were things he wanted to make right. The phrase made me laugh aloud, a dry, humorless sound that startled even me. Make right? How easily those words are said by people who have never stood in the debris of what they destroyed. I left the letter on the kitchen table and went about my day pretending it didn't exist. But of course it did. Its presence in the room was like a heartbeat I couldn't ignore. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing his face as it had been during those final months of illness. Pale, dependent, fragile. And then again in that moment at the grocery store. Healthy, self-assured, beside her. I wondered what he wanted now. Forgiveness? Validation? Some sentimental ritual to cleanse his conscience? The next morning, I reread the letter. His handwriting trembled in places, not from age, I thought, but from unease. And against my better judgment, I agreed to meet him. I told myself it wasn't weakness, that closure sometimes requires confrontation. But the truth was simpler. Part of me needed to see what I had survived. We met at a cafe halfway between my town and his, a neutral territory chosen, I suspect, to make things easier for him. He arrived early. When I walked in, he was already seated, a cup of tea steaming before him. I was startled by how ordinary he looked. Time had thinned his hair, added weight around his middle, softened the sharpness of his features. He looked like a man trying to age gracefully, and failing. When he saw me, he smiled, a reflex, polite and uncertain. I sat down across from him and folded my hands in my lap. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. He began with apologies. They were gentle, practiced, and useless. He said he had made mistakes, that he had been confused, that he had never meant to hurt me. I listened, not out of kindness, but because I wanted to understand what kind of man can walk away from love that had nursed him through death. His explanations were vague, full of words like journey, self-discovery, timing. I watched his lips move and thought how strange it was that this mouth had once whispered gratitude into my neck. He talked about Camille, too, though not by name. He said he had been in a relationship that had run its course. He didn't say she had left him, but the pause in his voice said enough. When he finally asked about me, I almost laughed. He said I looked well, as though wellness were a costume I had put on for the occasion. I told him I was fine, that life was quieter but peaceful. He nodded, perhaps disappointed that I wasn't broken enough to make his remorse more satisfying. He reached across the table as if to touch my hand, but I pulled it back before he could. Something flickered in his eyes then, something small and wounded, and I realized he had expected my forgiveness to come easily, as though I had been waiting for the opportunity to absolve him. I told him that there was nothing to make right, because there was no longer anything between us to repair. You ended it, I said. All that's left is memory, and I've already cleaned most of that out. He lowered his gaze. For a moment I thought he might cry, but he didn't. Men like him rarely cry for anything but themselves. We parted awkwardly. He asked if we could stay in touch. I said, "There's no need." As I walked to my car, the air sharp with cold, I felt an unexpected surge of relief. Seeing him had stripped away the last of the myth. The man I had loved was gone, and in his place was someone smaller, duller, human in the most disappointing way. I drove home with the windows cracked despite the chill, letting the wind take whatever residue of him was left. But peace never stays steady for long. 2 weeks later, my daughter called. Her voice was hesitant in that way adult children speak when they're about to deliver bad news to a parent. She told me she had run into Camille, by accident, at a charity event. She said Camille looked different. I asked what she meant. Tired, she said softly. Older somehow. I felt an unfamiliar mix of pity and vindication. My daughter hesitated before continuing. She mentioned Dad, she said. He's been sick again. The words hit me like cold water. For a moment I couldn't breathe. I asked what kind of sick, but she didn't know. She said he's struggling, she murmured. She said you were the strongest person she's ever met. I ended the call politely, then sat in silence for a long time. The past has a way of testing whether your forgiveness is real or just theoretical. I told myself it wasn't my concern, that his health no longer belonged to me. But that night, lying awake, I kept hearing the echoes of the hospital machines, the soft beeping that had once measured our shared existence. I remembered how his hand used to tighten around mine when pain hit, how he'd whisper, "Don't leave me." The cruelty of memory is that it resurrects tenderness even when you no longer want it. The next morning, without consciously deciding to, I drove toward the town where he lived. The route was muscle memory. I could have followed it blindfolded. I didn't plan to see him. I just wanted to see the house, to remind myself it was real. When I reached it, I parked across the street. The curtains were drawn, the garden unkempt, the mailbox overflowing. The sight should have pleased me, evidence that even his new life was subject to decay, but instead, it filled me with a hollow ache. I drove away before I could think too long about what that meant. A few days later, a message appeared on my phone, a number I didn't recognize. "Ellen, it's Camille. Please don't be angry. I thought you should know. David's in the hospital." There was an address. I deleted the message, then restored it, then deleted it again. For 2 days, I did nothing. I cleaned, I walked, I pretended I hadn't read it. But on the 3rd day, I found myself standing outside that hospital, the same sterile building where years earlier I had lived on coffee and fear. The smell of disinfectant was enough to make my knees tremble. I didn't go in. I sat in the parking lot for nearly an hour, watching the revolving doors, feeling like a ghost haunting my own past. When I finally drove home, I felt drained, as though I'd run a marathon without moving. That night, I dreamed of him, not as he was now, but as he'd been during the illness, frail, needy, half asleep in pain. I woke up with tears on my pillow and an anger that frightened me. Anger not at him, but at myself, for still being capable of compassion. The next morning, Camille called. Her voice was softer than I remembered from that single meeting years ago, stripped of its bright confidence. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said, "but he keeps asking for you. I don't know what to do." I almost hung up. But something in her tone, something defeated, made me pause. "I can't," I said finally. "It's not my place anymore." She whispered, "I understand," and hung up. For days afterward, her words echoed in my head. "It's not my place anymore." That sentence became both comfort and torment. I had spent years being indispensable, and now my irrelevance was absolute. And yet, beneath the pride, there was an ache of unfinished duty, the remnant of a vow that time and betrayal hadn't fully erased. 2 weeks later, I received another letter, this one from the hospital. He had listed me as an emergency contact years ago, and apparently it had never been changed. The note said he had been discharged, that follow-up appointments were scheduled, that he had declined further care. I crumpled the letter and threw it in the trash, but later, under the cover of night, I retrieved it and smoothed it out. I couldn't explain why. Maybe some part of me still believed that closure required seeing the end of his story. Winter deepened. The days grew short and sharp. I filled my hours with work at the shelter, feeding injured birds, cleaning cages, tending to creatures too fragile to survive the cold. There was something poetic in it, mending wings while mine were still learning to bear weight again. One afternoon, as I was leaving the center, I saw a figure leaning against a car near the gate. It took me a moment to recognize him. He looked smaller than I remembered, his shoulders hunched, his skin gray with exhaustion. He smiled faintly when he saw me. "You're hard to find," he said. I wanted to tell him to go, but my voice wouldn't cooperate. He said he'd just wanted to see me, to thank me. He looked older, not in the noble way of age, but in the defeated way of someone who's run out of defenses. He said he was sorry again, but this time it sounded different. Not rehearsed, not strategic, just tired. "She's gone," he said quietly. "She left last month." I said nothing. He took a deep breath, looked at the ground, and whispered, "You were always the strong one." Then he walked away before I could reply. I stood there long after he'd gone, the air cold against my face, and realized that strength had become my inheritance. Not bitterness, not pride, but endurance. Still, that night I cried. Not for him, but for the years that had built and broken us both. Grief, I have learned, can coexist with indifference. It doesn't need love to survive. A week later, I received one last envelope. Inside was a small note written in shaky handwriting. "Thank you for everything. I hope you find peace. D." There was no return address. I placed it in the same box that held his wedding ring, closed the lid, and set it on the highest shelf. Then I sat by the window and watched the snow fall in slow, deliberate spirals. The world was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes not from absence, but from acceptance. That winter marked the second escalation of my story, the point when the past came back, not to reclaim me, but to see if I could face it without drowning. I did not answer his calls after that. I did not attend his funeral months later when I learned of it through a mutual friend. Instead, I walked to the shore, stood at the edge of the frozen sea, and whispered his name once into the wind. The sound vanished instantly, swallowed by the air, and I felt a strange, steady calm. Love had once bound me to his survival. Now it was his memory that bound me to my own. And standing there, in that stark white landscape, I understood the truth that had taken me years to learn. The heart doesn't close like a door. It changes shape, and what no longer fits simply falls away. The day of my decision came without ceremony, without warning, the way clarity often does. Quietly, almost politely, as though it had been waiting for me to be ready. It was early spring, one of those mornings when the air feels undecided between cold and warmth. I woke before dawn, the light still gray, and sat at the edge of the bed, listening to the faint hum of the world beyond the window. The house felt unfamiliar, not in its emptiness, but in its stillness, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for me to move. I realized that for years I had been living as if someone might return, as if I were only ever preparing for or recovering from another person's choices. Even after he was gone, first into another woman's arms, and then, as I later learned, into the earth itself, I had been existing in reaction, orbiting a gravity that no longer existed. That morning, something in me decided it was over. Not the pain, it never truly leaves, but the waiting. I got up, dressed in the first clothes I touched, a simple gray sweater, jeans worn thin at the knees, and went into the kitchen. The table still held the small wooden box where I had kept his ring, his letter, the last relics of the life that had once defined me. I opened it. The ring lay in the same position it had occupied for months, a perfect circle, indifferent to its own symbolism. I picked it up and felt its weight, lighter than I remembered, almost insubstantial. It had once been the heaviest thing I owned. I slipped it into my pocket and poured myself a cup of coffee. The air was thick with silence, but not the kind that hurt anymore. It was the kind that clears a path. After breakfast, I walked to the shed at the back of the property where I had stored the old garden tools. It was a place I rarely entered. It still smelled faintly of his cologne and earth. On a shelf, in an old terracotta pot, I found a small packet of wildflower seeds I had bought years ago and forgotten. The label had faded, but the promise was still legible. Self-seeding perennials. Thrive in any soil. The simplicity of the words moved me. I decided, then and there, that the time had come to bury what was left, not as an act of mourning, but as an offering to the ground that had held every version of my life. The soil was cool and damp beneath my hands as I dug. The morning light had sharpened into gold by the time I placed the ring at the bottom of the small hole I'd made. It caught the sunlight once before being covered, a final flash before disappearance. I poured the seeds over it, a casual blessing, and began to fill the space with earth. Each handful felt deliberate, an act of reclamation. When I finished, I pressed my palms flat against the mound, as though sealing a promise. There was no prayer, no ritual phrase, just breath and quiet, and the faint rustle of wind moving through the trees. I stayed there for a long while, watching the sunlight shift across the grass, the air full of distant birdsong. It struck me that this was the same spot where he used to sit reading the paper in summer, his chair tilted back, his coffee cooling beside him. For a moment, I saw him there again, half smiling, the man I had once loved before everything grew complicated. I didn't hate that vision. I didn't need to. Hate is another way of staying tethered, and I was done being tied to ghosts. I stood, brushed the dirt from my hands, and whispered something I hadn't said aloud in years. "Thank you for leaving." The words startled me with their honesty. Gratitude, after all, is not the same as forgiveness. It was not him I thanked, but the emptiness he left, because it had forced me to rebuild a self that didn't need saving. I walked back to the house, leaving the small grave behind. Later, perhaps in weeks or months, flowers would grow there, unplanned, unarranged, beautiful precisely because they owed their existence to accident. That thought felt like peace. Inside, I cleaned. Not out of compulsion, but because I wanted the house to look as new as it finally felt. I washed the curtains, moved the furniture, painted the walls a soft yellow. Every change erased another trace of the woman who had once lived only to be useful. When I finished, I stood in the center of the living room, barefoot on the wooden floor, and realized that for the first time in years, the house no longer echoed. It absorbed sound instead of reflecting it. It was mine now, truly mine, and the quiet that filled it was the kind that accompanies freedom. That night, I took a drive without a destination. The road wound along the coast, the sea visible only in glimmers between the cliffs. I rolled down the window, letting the wind whip through my hair, carrying away whatever fragments of sorrow still clung to me. Somewhere near the overlook where the land dropped steeply to the rocks below, I pulled over and stepped out. The air smelled of salt and rain, and the horizon was vast and trembling with light. I took the letter he had written, the one that had arrived months ago, folded neatly, still unread since the day I had placed it in the box, and tore it into small pieces. The paper fluttered from my hands like pale birds scattering into the wind. I watched until the last shred disappeared. It wasn't an act of rage, it was a release. He had written to seek absolution, but forgiveness is not a gift I owe anyone. It's something I grant myself. As I stood there, a strange sense of calm spread through me, deep and unwavering. I thought of all the versions of myself I had been: the young bride with soft hands and blind hope, the caretaker bending over a sickbed, the abandoned wife staring at an empty chair, the woman learning to walk again through loneliness. Each of those selves had carried me here, to this quiet shore, to this moment of balance. The grief had not vanished, but it had settled into its proper place. No longer a wound, just a scar, and even scars, I realized, are proof of healing. When I returned home, the sky had darkened into indigo, and the house welcomed me with its stillness. I lit a single candle and sat at the table, writing in my notebook. The words came easily this time, steady and unforced. I wrote about strength, not the kind that shouts or conquers, but the kind that endures in silence, that holds its ground when the world falls apart. I wrote about love that does not vanish but transforms, reshaping itself into something quieter, less desperate, more truthful. I wrote until my hand ached and the candle burned low. When I finished, I signed my name at the bottom, not for anyone else to read, but because I wanted to see it written by my own hand. Later that week, I made one final decision. I sold the house. It was not out of spite or sadness, but necessity. I had built too many memories inside those walls, both beautiful and cruel, and I needed to live somewhere that belonged only to the present. I bought a small RV, old but dependable, and began mapping a route up the coast. It was an impulsive choice, the kind he would have mocked in me, but I didn't need permission anymore. I told no one except my daughter, who, after a moment of hesitation, smiled and said, "Good. You deserve the whole horizon." On the morning I left, I stood at the threshold with my bags packed, the keys in my hand. The garden was quiet. The mound of earth where the ring lay hidden, barely visible beneath the first shoots of green. I touched the doorframe one last time and whispered a promise to myself. Never again will I confuse devotion with self-erasure. Then I turned the key, locked the door, and walked away, without looking back. The engine started on the first try. As I drove, the sun broke through the clouds, filling the road ahead with light. By midday, the ocean stretched beside me, vast and mercilessly alive. I stopped at a cliffside turnout and stepped out to watch the waves crash below. The air was cold, the wind fierce, but it felt like an embrace. I took a photograph, not of the view, but of my own shadow, cast long against the rocks. Proof that I existed, that I had survived not just him, but the version of myself that had once believed love required disappearance. That moment was my culmination, my quiet rebellion against everything that had diminished me. No legal battle, no revenge, no spectacle. Just a woman, finally untethered, standing at the edge of her own life and claiming it with both hands. The horizon shimmered with possibility. Somewhere far below, the waves roared their endless chorus, erasing everything that had ever been written in the sand. I closed my eyes, breathed in the salt and light, and thought, I am still here, and this time, I belong to myself. I have been living on the road for almost a year now, though time no longer behaves the way it used to. Days stretch and fold into one another like fabric, soft at the seams, never quite finished. My home is a small, white RV with curtains I sewed from scraps of old dresses, the ones that once waited at the back of my closet for an occasion that never came. I keep a tin kettle, 2 mugs, a stack of notebooks, and a photograph of the sea I took the day I left. The rest of my life fits into drawers and memories. There is something liberating about smallness, about realizing that everything essential can be carried within you. I spend my mornings near the coast, sometimes parked beside cliffs or fields that roll down into the water, and I wake to the sound of gulls and wind pressing against the windows. The world feels enormous again, and I have become a part of it rather than an observer, trapped behind the glass of someone else's story. When people ask, as they sometimes do in passing at campgrounds or gas stations, if I am traveling alone, I nod. Their expressions shift from curiosity to pity, to a kind of reluctant admiration. They ask if it's lonely, and I tell them no. Though loneliness is still a companion of mine, it has just changed shape. It no longer sits beside me like a shadow, but moves through me like air. There are nights, of course, when silence becomes too heavy, when memory prowls the edges of my thoughts. But even then, I am not afraid of it. I have learned to let sadness visit without letting it unpack its bags. Sometimes, when the road winds too long without destination, I stop in small towns. I volunteer at shelters, libraries, even once at a hospice center for a few weeks. I don't tell them much about myself. I simply help, folding sheets, reading to the old and dying, feeding stray animals that wander near the fences. There is a quiet symmetry in it, as though I've come full circle. Once I cared for one man until it broke me. Now I care for whoever crosses my path, and it builds me instead of consuming me. Service, I've learned, is only destructive when it's given without selfhood. Given freely, with boundaries, it becomes something holy. I write, too. The words that once felt trapped behind walls of shame and exhaustion now spill easily. In every town I leave behind a story or a letter, sometimes in the pocket of a library book, sometimes pinned to a notice board in a cafe. They are unsigned, but they all carry the same closing line. To any woman who has been left behind, remember that you are not the remainder, you are the sum. Once, in Oregon, a woman found me weeks later in the same parking lot where I'd left a note. She was crying when she knocked on my door. "Did you write this?" she asked, holding out the slip of paper. I didn't answer directly, only invited her in for tea. We talked for hours, and when she left, she hugged me as though she were saying goodbye to a version of herself she no longer needed. After she drove off, I sat for a long while, watching the steam rise from our cups, and I realized that healing multiplies when it's shared. There are moments when I think of him, not as a wound, but as a character in a finished story. I can recall his voice, his laughter, even the way his eyes used to search mine when he was ill, looking for reassurance I didn't always have to give. But these memories have lost their power to unmake me. They exist like fossils, solid, harmless, evidence of a life once alive. I don't wish him pain. I don't even wish him peace. I wish him distance, the kind that makes all human failings small and forgivable. I used to believe closure was something one person granted another, but I see now it's simply the moment when you stop rewriting the same chapter. One evening, while parked near a bird sanctuary in Northern California, I watched a rescued hawk being released back into the wild. Its wings, still uneven from injury, beat the air with fierce determination. For a moment, it hovered uncertainly, then found its current and soared, a blur against the dusk. I felt something rise in me at that sight. Not envy, not sadness, but recognition. Freedom, I realized, doesn't mean never being caged. It means remembering how to fly after you've been grounded. That night, I dreamed of the wildflowers I had planted over his ring, how they must have bloomed by now, maybe even spread beyond the small patch I made for them. Life insists on continuing. Even what is buried still reaches for light. Now, wherever I stop, I plant something small. A seed, a sprig, a handful of herbs in borrowed soil. I never stay long enough to see them grow, but that's not the point. I like to think that somewhere behind me, tiny gardens are thriving without my supervision, proof that care doesn't need permanence to matter. Each seed is a reminder. What we nurture outlasts what we lose. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the stars spill across the sky in impossible numbers, I speak aloud to the version of myself who once sat in a hospital room holding a dying man's hand, believing that love was synonymous with endurance. I tell her she was brave, that she did what she could, that her mistake was not loving too much, but forgetting that she herself was also worthy of that kind of care. I tell her it's all right to let go. The universe listens, I think. The wind always seems to soften after I speak. I have no grand plans for the future, no fixed address, no clear end to this journey. But I have learned to trust the rhythm of movement, the way roads unfurl like stories, the way the horizon always waits. Some days I park by the water and simply sit with a notebook, writing about the women I've met, the ones rebuilding after losses of their own, the ones still searching for the courage to walk away, the ones who have already found it and look unrecognizable to themselves in their new strength. I send those words out into the world like offerings, like messages in bottles. If they reach someone who needs them, then my story continues through theirs. The world is softer now. Even the grief feels like a friend who walks beside me instead of weighing on my shoulders. I wake early, make coffee, open the window, and let the air fill my lungs. Each breath is a kind of forgiveness, not of him, but of myself. For the years I spent trying to be everything for someone who saw me as nothing more than background. The road hums beneath my tires when I start the engine, and the sound is like a pulse, steady and alive. I am older now, yes, but not smaller. The years have distilled me. I am what remains when everything unnecessary has burned away. I often think that if another woman were to find this story, somewhere down the line, folded between the pages of a forgotten book, or told secondhand by someone who once met me on the road, I would want her to understand this, that survival is not the same as bitterness, that solitude can be sacred, that love, real love, sometimes begins only when the need to be chosen ends. So this is my resolution, the quiet after the long storm. I live simply. I move often. And I love the world without asking it to love me back. I carry no ghosts now, only echoes that hum softly when the wind shifts. Every night before I sleep, I whisper the same words to the dark. I am here. I am whole. I am enough. And the darkness, which once frightened me, always answers with silence. A silence that feels, finally, like peace.